Welcome to our Fort Collins Book Fest 5-year celebration. Hi, I'm Matt West. I'm the business librarian for the Poudre Libraries. Today we're celebrating our 5 years of the Fort Collins Book Festival, a virtual celebration of books and brews, writings and riffs, food and thought, big science, and the great outdoors. As always, we are also celebrating the importance of literature, writing, books, and our libraries. Check out the virtual program at focobookfest.org. We have book talks, discussions, panels, prose, poetry readings, all free. Make sure you attend as many as you can, and please share with your family and friends. Before we get to our panel, I'd like to thank our sponsors. This festival could not happen without their generous support. Today's event is produced by the Poudre River Public Library District in partnership with the CSU Morgan Library. Our presenting sponsor is the City of Fort Collins Fort Fund. Further support has been provided by Friends of the Poudre Library District, Friends of the Morgan Library, Lilia B. Morgan Endowment Fund, Downtown Development Authority, Liggett Johnson and Goodman PC, Front Range Community College, Downtown Fort Collins Creative District, Old Firehouse Books, and our media partners, KUNC and 105.5, the Colorado Sound. We also like to give special thanks to Northern Colorado writers for presenting all 4 of our writer workshops. Thank you to all of them. And thank you so much for celebrating our 5th annual FOCO Book Festival. Now I'd like to introduce Luke Runyon, who will go ahead and introduce our panelists and discussion. Luke Runyon is a reporter covering the Colorado River Basin for public radio station KUNC in Greeley, Colorado. His investigations show how water issues can unite and divide communities throughout the Western U.S. Luke produces feature stories for KUNC and a network of public media stations in Colorado, Utah, Wyoming, New Mexico, Kansas, Arizona, California, and Nevada. Before covering water at KUNC, Luke covered agriculture and the food beat for 5 years as the station's Harvest public media reporter. He has also reported for the Aspen Public Radio in Aspen, Colorado, Illinois Public Radio in Springfield. His reports have been featured on NPR's Morning Edition, All Things Considered, Weekend Edition, Here and Now, and APM's Marketplace. He is a graduate of the University of Illinois Public Affairs Reporting Program. Luke's work has been recognized by the Society of Environmental Journalists, Radio Television Digital News Association, and the Colorado Broadcasters Association, and the Public Media Journalists Association. Without further ado, I'll hand this off to Luke Runyon.
Thanks, Matthew. And hi to everyone out there for joining us for this discussion as part of the Fort Collins Book Festival. Congratulations on 5 years. Like Matthew said, my name is Luke Runyon, and I cover the Colorado River Basin for KUNC and this network of public radio stations all throughout the Southwest. And if you're unfamiliar with the Colorado River, it is an important part of life in the West. It supplies drinking and irrigation water for 40 million people across 7 states in the US and in Mexico. It's a big, important river to the region, and its management is incredibly complicated, very complex, and we're going to do our best over the next hour or so in trying to make it a little more understandable, and hopefully bring together some issues related to rivers around the world, and bring home some takeaways that maybe we can learn from here in the United States. So time is limited during this webinar, and I want to jump right in and learn as much as I can from our panelists. The plan is to keep this pretty casual, as is the Fort Collins style. I wouldn't want to deviate from that. And I'm going to introduce each of our panelists and ask them a question to sort of kick things off that I hope will act as a launching point for the rest of the discussion. Then I have a few follow-up questions, and then we'll open things up to the audience with about 15 or 20 minutes left in the program. And if none of you inquisitive book readers have any questions, I'll do my best to fill in those gaps, but I don't think that that's going to be a problem. And then we'll wrap things up at 5 o'clock. So the first question to each of our panelists is, what makes you either optimistic or pessimistic about the future of rivers in the Western United States. So we'll start with Fred Pearce. Fred is a freelance author and a journalist based in London, where he's joining us tonight, where it's 11 o'clock at night in London. So thanks, Fred, for staying up. A former news editor of the UK-based New Science magazine. He's been its environment consultant since 1992, reporting from 89 countries. He also writes regularly for the Yale E360 website and The Guardian and other newspapers in the UK, as well as irregularly for many other outlets, including the Washington Post and the New York Times. His recent books include Fallout, A Journey Through the Nuclear Age, and a revised edition of his best-selling When the Rivers Run Dry. His books have been translated into 26 languages. I have a copy right here. I took it backpacking with me this summer. So Fred, what makes you either optimistic or pessimistic about the future of rivers in the Western United States?
Oh, I can do both. I could be optimistic and pessimistic. The pessimism comes from what's happening to the climate. It's getting drier. We all know that. The forecasts are that it will carry on getting drier across the American West, and the Colorado River is right in the heart of that. And we have the prospect from analysis of the history of climate in the West of really long super droughts. So not droughts that last for 3, 5, even 10 years, but droughts that last for 50 years or 60 years. And given that the climate change forecasts, they're not entirely reliable, but are suggesting it's getting drier and it's going to carry on getting drier, that's something to worry about. When the water of the Colorado River was divided up between states early in the last century, there seemed to be quite a lot of water in the river, and the divisions were made, how much water each state could have each year, were quite generous. But we don't get that amount of water now. There's less water going down the river. So it's really getting very tight. You, Luke, write there were stories about the pressure points all the time. It's going to get worse. But my optimism is because we could use water a lot better. We waste water a lot. That can make me pessimistic, but we can use water so much better in our homes, in agriculture especially, which is the big uses. And there is a structure on the Colorado River for managing these things. Many rivers around the world that I see don't have that. So I can be pessimistic, but my temperament is to be optimistic that you can solve the problems. They're certainly not insoluble.
Great. All right, our next panelist is Jennifer Gimble. Jennifer is the Senior Water Policy Scholar for the Colorado Water Center, based at Colorado State University. And in this position, she teaches a graduate seminar on water issues and develops policy strategy papers on issues facing the Colorado River and the Upper Basin states. Before that, she served as the Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary for Water and Science in the Department of the Interior, long title, and was Deputy Commissioner for External and Intergovernmental Affairs for the Bureau of Reclamation. From 2008 to 2013, Gimble was the director of the Colorado Water Conservation Board. That's a group within the Department of Natural Resources for the state that works to protect and develop the state's water resources. She has represented both Colorado and Wyoming in numerous water issues while working in each state's attorney general offices. She's also worked on Indian settlement issues for the Department of the Interior. So if we have any water policy and law questions, Jennifer should be able to answer them. So Jennifer, what makes you pessimistic or optimistic?
Well, thank you. And I'm going to agree with Fred. I'm a little bit both ways with respect to water in the West right now. I understand the climate issues, and I hopefully Brad will go into that. But I'm going to come at this from a policy and a legal point of view. What gives me optimism is the work that's been done on the Colorado River. Ever since this drought started 20 years ago, you have seen the states and stakeholders and two nations come together and figure out how to sustainably operate and manage the river. Important documents are like the interim guidelines. We had minutes 319 and 323. The nation of Mexico is sharing in shortages with respect to drought conservation plans. So that to me shows the optimism with respect to how people can come together and work when we have these difficult times. The pessimism, I kind of look to like the Rio Grande. In lower Rio Grande, you have Texas suing New Mexico over taking too much groundwater is their allegations. You have Texas and New Mexico, New Mexico and Texas fighting over the Pecos River. I look at California and how they're still struggling with the Central Valley Project and how to increase supplies with respect to that. And by the way, California only stores enough water to get through a year. So the fires that they're experiencing are going to be devastating to their supplies.
Great. Thanks, Jennifer. And lastly, we have Brad Udall. Brad is a senior water and climate research scientist and scholar at Colorado State University's Colorado Water Center. Brad's expertise includes climate change, hydrology, and related policy issues at the American West with a focus on the Colorado River. He was a contributing author to the 2014 IPCC Climate Change Report and was a co-author of the 2018 U.S. National Climate Assessment, which I reference all the time in my reporting. He was also an author of a 2008 State of Colorado Climate Change Assessment and the 2009 National Climate Assessment. In 2017, with co-author Jonathan Overpeck, he wrote an influential paper on the ongoing Colorado River hot drought, maybe even coined the term. He spent 6 months in Australia studying their water reforms after their millennium drought. Brad has testified to Congress multiple times, provided input to several National Academy of Science panels, and has given hundreds of talks on climate change impacts to water resources, water law, water policy. He's a member of the Colorado River Research Group and was formerly the director of the Getchus Wilkinson Center for Natural Resources, Energy, and the Environment at CU Boulder, and director of the University of Colorado NOAA Western Water Assessment. Long list of accomplishments, Brad. He also he also has sort of a Western pedigree with the Udall name. So Brad, what makes you optimistic and pessimistic about water these days?
Yeah, well, thanks for that kind introduction. Hello, fellow panelists and fellow folks joining us. You know, I think Fred's approach is right, and Jennifer's as well. You can be both optimist and pessimist here. I'm an optimist who worries a lot, is an expression I like to use. Clearly, climate change, as Fred pointed out, is a really serious issue, and the West is aridifying as we speak. These fires, frankly, are terrifying. Just behind us here, right? We now have the state of Colorado's largest fire ever. It just blossomed up into another big firestorm in the last couple of days. And the worry here is that these fire landscapes actually don't grow back to trees. They return just to shrubs. And that'll reduce runoff. That's been very little discussed, frankly, in the scientific literature. And in addition to both reductions in water supply, we're also looking at water quality issues too. So that's my pessimism. My optimism hits at what Jennifer suggested, which is really the people who manage this system. You know, the Colorado River has this long history of both, I would argue, great contention, and we saw that through the 20th century, and also enormous collaboration that began around 2000. And the 7 basin states, Mexico, the 29 tribes, the federal government, people want to do right by each other. They want to do right by their states. They meet regularly. There's really good communication, and that gives me great optimism that we're going to come up with solutions that make sense for the most people most of the time.
Brad, just to follow up on that, what can you tell us about what we know a climate changed future looks like in the Colorado River Basin over the next few decades? Like, you know, Fred kind of in his opening statement, was talking about some of these maybe potentially conflicting models and what they show. What does the clearest science show us for what the future of climate change looks like in the Colorado Basin?
So let me talk first about temperatures, because this is where we're absolutely certain what's going to happen. And the new framing on temperatures is, hey, this was the hottest August ever. This is the coolest August you're going to see for the next 100 years. That's the way to frame this. It's going to get warmer consistently throughout the 21st century in a way that will reduce water supplies. And that gets to the term that you said I coined, I'm not sure I coined, hot drought. In the 1950s and 20th century, the droughts we had were predominantly caused by a lack of precipitation. The current drought we have, has a small precipitation decline, but in the absence of these temperatures would not be excessive. We would not be particularly stressed about this drought. These hotter temperatures are driving more evaporation, and that's declining our river flows significantly, perhaps up to 10% loss in flow per degree Celsius warming. And we're already maybe 1.25 degrees, or in some places of the basin, as the Washington Post recently pointed out, over 2 Celsius around Grand Junction. So those higher temperatures are reducing the flows for sure. It's less clear what's going to happen to precipitation. It looks like as you go north, it may get wetter or more precipitation, although that won't necessarily turn into more runoff. In the southern portions of the basin, we clearly expect it to dry. Where that north-south dividing line is really not clear. A lot of models place it right in the middle of the state of Colorado. But again, let me underline that more precipitation won't necessarily lead to more runoff. It's just going to evaporate. It may alleviate some of the drying, but may not actually help us out all that much.
Fred, I'm curious, in your research, I mean, you've done reporting and storytelling from the Western US. What have you learned in studying rivers around the world? What kinds of lessons have you picked up maybe in studying those rivers that we could start applying here in the West? What are we missing at this point?
I don't think you're missing a lot in many ways. You suffer the problems that most people suffer around the world, the sort of lingering expectation that water will always be available or somehow should always be available. And it's not in so many places seen as, if you like, the limiting resource for agriculture, or industry or cities, but in the American West, you're having to pioneer really intense use of water, large populations, growing populations in environments of really very limited water supply. So in some extent, you're ahead, and the Colorado River is an example, one of the earliest examples in the world of finding a means of sharing out water in a reasonably effective way. I think I would argue that Mexico gets a poor deal on the River Colorado as it does on the share out of the Rio Grande as well. So there are certainly some equity issues about that. But you're pioneering things here, and so yeah, I'm sure there are things to learn from the rest of the world. But the rest of the world is in many ways following you. You can look at places around the world where people use water much more efficiently. If you go to Israel, for instance, you'll see the extent to which they recycle water. I mean, they're living in a desert there. They're doing a lot of desalination of seawater, and they're also recycling urban wastewater to use for agricultural irrigation. We're all going to be doing an awful lot more of that. Or you can go to a city like Singapore, which is a city-state reliant for its water supplies on a neighbor, on Malaysia. They've got their leakage rate in their city areas down to around 5%. Nobody else in the world has done anything like that, but it shows what you can do. So I think in many ways, administratively, the US is in the lead. Perhaps technologically, surprisingly, maybe you're lagging rather, and that has more to do with incentives than the absence of technology. And that's, if you like, where my optimism comes from. I do believe that there are solutions to the water shortages, but in many parts of the world, we're going to have to go through the crisis before they're actually adopted.
Yeah, we keep hearing about how we're going to have to adapt to climate change, and I think climate change adaptation is an easy thing to say and a hard thing to actually wrap your mind around, especially when it comes to water in the West, because we've built, in some cases, some rigid structures. And Jennifer, the kind of the legal system around water in the West, I would say maybe isn't known for its adaptability or its flexibility. How do we do that? How do we build kind of the necessary adaptation into our law and our policy around this incredibly important resource that is feeling pressure from this outside force?
Well, look, that's an interesting question, and I get that one a lot, but I would argue that we have shown how we've been able to work within the rigid nature of that law. It's not as rigid as it sounds initially. And here in Colorado specifically, and in some of the other states, we've taken a lot of baby steps to open up that law to help us with like water conservation and in-stream flows and recreational flows for our rivers. And so it's not as rigid as people say it is. It's like the Colorado River Compact. People say that that is very rigid, but we have shown in the last 20 years that with the states working together, it's not as rigid as we originally thought.
I wonder how I think a lot of times the Colorado River Basin can be propped up as this kind of like kumbaya river basin, at least over the last 20 years. I think it gets a lot of credit for water managers being able to work together. But are we moving fast enough to address this particular issue? I always hear there's always this kind of constant tension between incrementalism and sort of radical change in lots of different public policy issues, and I think water is among them. Do you, and this is maybe to all three of you, do you think that we're moving fast enough in order to address some of these scarcity issues? And who could potentially lose out if we're not?
Well, I'd answer that question by saying there might be several that lose out if we don't take it incrementally. And I think that we've made some good steps to completely. You have to remember that a water right is a property right in the West, and that somebody has the right to use that water. And so you have to work within that constitutional, U.S. constitutional construct. And we're starting to have conversations about how to do that with respect to like demand and management. All 4 upper basin states are talking with their stakeholders about how can we conserve water and help us keep the river a little more sustainable. And I asked Brad and Fred to comment on that too.
Something that interests me is the extent to which the markets can be used to mediate some of these issues. Some people have high expectations of that, but they raise really interesting issues when you find cities buying up farmland, not because they want the land, but because they want the water rights that go with that. And I know there have been some recent issues around that. And you really need kind of public policy making to decide whether that's acceptable. You can't just have a sort of free market in water. Otherwise, some of us would get really very short of water. So I think an interesting question, particularly in the US, is to establish what role there may be for markets in water, what limits there have to be in markets with water, or whether you can just let it rip and let the cities buy up all the agricultural rights where they need them. And perhaps another issue is whether the rights of people who have been taking water from outside the basin, Now, in many parts of the world, the river basin is kind of sacrosanct, and the people within the river basin have the rights to that water. But on the Colorado, despite the water shortages, Arizona is taking a lot of water. They have a pipeline that goes out to Phoenix. A lot of water is being taken out of the basin. The other side, it's being taken out to keep the taps, keep the faucets flowing in San Diego and so on. And Utah has a new pipeline project I've been reading about as well. So again, there are issues. Should there be a preferential right for people living within a river basin to have that water, or again, should there be a kind of freer system? I think those issues are all up for grabs.
Brad, what do you think?
Jump in and answer your question really quickly.
Yeah.
So in 2000, the nation's two largest reservoirs, Lake Mead and Lake Powell, both on the Colorado River, were 100% full. From the year 2000 2004, they lost half of their contents. They've not refilled since then. We just had a stunningly dry year. Here in Colorado, we had 100% of snowpack on April 1, which would imply close to 100% of runoff, and we got 52% of runoff. Almost unheard of. I think it's unprecedented. I can't say that flatly, but I think it's that case. This river system, 25% of Los Angeles' supply, 90% of Las Vegas. If we had 2000 to 2004 repeat, we would drain those reservoirs, and it would be a very challenging situation. So I don't know the answer to your question if we're moving fast enough, but I will tell you, nature could throw some curveballs at us that makes the answer no, we're not, and it could be right in our face very soon. I hope that's not the case, and that we actually have time to do the negotiations that are now kicked off, that are supposed to end in 2026, that set in place roughly another 25-year period of management. And hopefully those will deal with climate change and provide a good foundation for making sure everybody gets what they need.
One thing that I hear in the Colorado River Basin all the time is that this is a basin that is going to have to learn how to live with less water. And that implies that everyone is going to have to use less. Is that true? We hear a lot about equity. Fred brought up this concept of equity earlier. Who is going to feel the pain the earliest? And is that really true that everyone is going to have to end up using less in order to keep the whole system functioning? Brad, do you want to take that?
Sure. So herein we run into Western water law, right? And throughout Western water law, you have this notion of priority, where first in time means first in right. And to some extent, that applies mostly within states. It also, unfortunately, in the case of Colorado, applies between states because of an unusual agreement that was reached in 1968 that unfortunately puts the risk of shortage quite heavily on the state of Arizona. And they willingly agreed to this. It was actually my father, part of the congressional delegation, you hinted at my background there, who signed on to this. Arizona was desperate at the time and was willing to do that. Since 1968, there's been a lot of deep thinking on this. Former general manager of Las Vegas used the term shared sacrifice a lot and said that was a far better way to share the pain here. Let me note that in the upper basin, there are lots and lots and lots of water users who don't have the benefit of big storage systems above them. And so they're going to get shorted. They're going to get no water in a climate change world because they don't have any place to store water. So I don't know exactly what the answer is here, but I will tell you the water managers in the basin understand that we can't entirely cut Arizona out, and that there has to be some element of shared sacrifice. It may not be entirely equal in the lower basin, and how we deal with upper basin water users is going to be a little bit of a challenge, and a lot of that will be ag users. So great question, and I don't know the entire answer for you.
You knew the answer, you'd solve the whole problem. Jennifer, do you want to weigh in on that?
Brad said it very, very well, and so I don't think I have anything more to add.
I think another issue is groundwater, underground water reserves. We tend not to think about those too much because they are literally hidden underground. So we're talking about the Colorado, but in many areas, the water from the Colorado is being supplemented by pumping out groundwater. So the suburbs of Phoenix, when they can't get as much water coming down the Central Arizona Project Canal, are pumping up water from underground. But in arid areas, that's fossil water. It's not water which is going to be replaced. So it's a one-off resource. You could say, well, it'll always rain in the headwaters or snow in the headwaters of the Colorado at some point. You'll always have some water to share out. But once you pumped out some of these underground water reserves, they're only going to come back over timeframes of hundreds and thousands of years. So that's a kind of hidden problem in much of the West, which is much less discussed, but for the longer term, perhaps a more profound issue as to how habitable parts of the West are going to be. So again, with my pessimistic hat on, I would suggest that we need to think about groundwater reserves as well, because they are, we're mining water in parts of the West in a way that's not sustainable. Like a coal mine, it's gonna empty one day.
Look, if I can jump in here. An example, Fred, and I read it again in your book here the other day, and that is the Rio Grande. You have El Paso and Juarez relying on almost solely on groundwater supplies, and those aquifers are diminishing very, very quickly. It is a real-time problem that they have right now.
Fred, I often hear from people in the West that, a lot of times I'll tell someone what I do, report on water, and they'll say, oh, that's so important. I don't understand it at all. And part of that is like the bar to entry can be so high where people know that the issue is very important and kind of critical for the region, but the concepts all feel so not understandable. How do you go about using stories and reporting to help people bridge that gap so that they can understand, like, yes, it's important, and I can actually wrap my mind around it?
Well, I think the river is really useful for that. I mean, I've written about water for over many decades, really. I wrote my first book about the UK water industry back in the 1980s. So framing the issue, or the world water crisis, people kind of understand that as an idea, but how do you cope with it? I found the framing around rivers running dry useful, and that's why I called my book When the Rivers Run Dry, because it seemed to be a frame for thinking about these things. And, rivers do literally run dry. Some of the great rivers of the world, the Colorado is one, but, the Yellow River in China, the Indus in Pakistan, the Murray River in Australia, whole bunch of them that literally, the Nile in Africa, that literally run dry for parts of the year and sometimes almost the entire year. And that's a kind of framing. People can understand that. So once you reach that point, it's a visible symbol of how water is a limited resource. A lot of people say, well, it rains again. So, the water has always come back. It's a renewable resource. Water is a great renewable resource. We'd be in real trouble if it wasn't. But the fact is that in any one place, at any one time, you can only have access to so much water. There's only so much water that comes down a river in a year. There's only so much water that you can have access to. And it is often a limiting factor in society. People, historically, archaeologists have talked about hydraulic civilizations that were built around rivers in ancient Mesopotamia and elsewhere. And they're framed around water. So if you start telling those stories, people begin to see that water is not just something that comes out of a faucet, not just something that you need to spray your crops with, but it is a kind of fundamental resource without which, we're all dying of thirst in the desert.
You ever find yourself getting too dragged into the weeds, though? Like, a little too heady about some of these particular issues?
Oh yeah, I constantly get dragged in too far. I mean, I'm a bit of a nerd, and the story, I get taken over by the stories of particular places. But I then kick myself and try and stand back and say, yeah, what's the big picture here? And I think one of the, if I can go on, I think one of the really big issues here now is that we're all used to thinking water as, if you like, to use the language of economists, it's a supply side problem. If you don't have enough water, build another dam, put in another pipeline, do something to deliver more water. And in a water limited world, which, okay, if you're living in the Amazon, there's a lot of water, but much of the world is now a water limited world now. We've got to think about it as a demand side problem. We don't need to spend the money on another dam. We need to spend money on more efficient irrigation systems, more efficient plumbing systems, more efficient machines for washing our clothing in, whatever it is. We can do things a lot better, and that's how we're going to get around the problems that we're facing. Also, we're going to talk a lot more about recycling water, using water not just once before it goes off from when it falls out of the sky to when it gets to the ocean, but using it several times over. I mentioned Israel. Other countries are beginning to realize that if you clean up wastewater coming out of cities, you can use it for irrigation. You're getting two bites. And if your original water comes from desalinating seawater, still expensive, but not so expensive now. You're getting a lot of, you could do much more with the water that's available. And we're going to have to think about that. We're going to be thinking, same as we're recycling many other of our basic resources, metals and so on, we're going to be recycling water a lot more.
I just heard this concept the other day called laundry to landscape. So you can install a certain capture system in your home that takes the water that's used to wash your clothes and send it out into your garden or your landscaping in order to irrigate your plants. It was a whole new concept for me. You obviously can't be using bleach or any of those sorts of things, but that's just kind of
you could do it. Absolutely, you can do it. You can do it domestically. Many more households, and this is a traditional thing, but it's coming back even in urban environments now. It's just catching the rainwater off your roof. Don't let it run away into the drains. Capture it and use it. You may not want to drink it, but it will water your garden. It'll keep your golf courses green. We have to think about these. Just think about water as a resource that matters and is not unlimited. It'll open up a lot of ideas. Mm-hmm. Just as we're thinking about green energy, we're going to have to think more about green water.
And at least here in Colorado, they're finally legal after a few years. A few years ago, we actually made rain barrels legal. So you can do what you're saying, and you're not instructing people to do illegal activities in their backyards, Fred.
Yeah, state authorities, and it still happens in some parts of the world, they say you can't do that because you're stopping the water going in our reservoirs. You're holding up the water supply, but actually it's a really efficient way of using water, catching it off the roof.
I've got one more question for the three of you, and then maybe we'll open it up for audience questions. I always hear from people, sometimes the reporting and stories that I do, they can feel so much larger than what the individual person can do. These negotiations that are taking place between water managers can, not feel so relatable and feels like, oh, it's, they're going to figure it out. What little individual decision can I make? What would you say to people about what sort of changes they can make in their own lives and how those can end up feeling significant?
If you want me to come in, there's only so much we can do. We've talked a little bit about how in your own domestic environment, you can use water more efficiently. But we have to accept that the water is the ultimate sort of collective resource. And maybe the only way you can influence things is, I'm not going to get involved in your elections coming up here now, but you have to make political choices and vote for people at every level of administration who you think are going to be good custodians of a resource like water. There's, you know, we can't individually solve all our problems. These are collective endeavors, and I don't have a problem with that.
Well, and I would say just educating yourself about those issues. Fred mentioned earlier about the fact that we have infrastructure, aging infrastructure under our cities that's leaking like a sieve. Well, to fix that, you're going to have to raise the water rates. And that's hard for people to understand, that you're asking me to use less water, but you're asking me to pay more for it. And understanding how important that is, I think, is helpful.
I might add that under Jennifer's idea of education, there's an entity called the Colorado Foundation for Water Education, and they have a whole series of citizens guides that are quite excellent. You know, the other area where individuals can make a big difference in the West is on the landscaping around your house. It's a roughly 50% of water use in the West, and if it's turf grass and isn't being used, and you have some time and money and want to make it beautiful, you can do lovely things ripping out that turf grass. It's a lot of work, mind you, but it can actually make a significant difference in the water consumption of your household if you're not watering as much turf.
And here in Fort Collins, it's technically illegal right now to be watering your turf, thanks to some emergency mandatory outdoor watering restrictions due to a whole combination of factors. But yeah, you know, it seems like people will respond to some of these policy changes on their own. Like at first, Fort Collins, was just voluntary water restrictions, and then they became mandatory. And you can see a very steep drop off after October 1st, when these watering restrictions went into place, that, you know, people listened. They, for the most part, are going to restrict their water use if they're asked to. And there were enough circumstances that they were instructed to do so. Well, I'm going to pass things off to Matthew again, so that we can get some audience questions and hear what you all have to say. Matthew?
Hi. So from the downtown Fort Collins Creative District, they are asking, 4 cities in Colorado, including Fort Collins, just made the list of the 5 best places to live in the nation, encouraging people to move here. So as our statewide populations continue to increase, what can we do to educate our current citizens and the newcomers to be part of the solution to water shortages and healthy rivers?
Well, I think it starts off with telling everybody this is a really crappy place to live. That's what you need to do first.
We're going to keep ending up on those lists, Brad.
Well, we covered some of this citizens guides out of the Colorado Foundation for Water Education. I mean, there are a whole series of terrific books out there. Fred's book, Science Be Damned, is a book by Eric Kuhn and John Fleck. You want to understand about the Colorado, there's a book by David Owen called Where the Water Goes. There are books on groundwater, high and dry, by Bill Alley. I mean, there's just tons of terrific resources out there if people want to take the time to educate themselves. That's asking a lot out of people. I don't know. What do other people think?
Well, I would point to a program that we have at the CSU Water Center called Literate Leaders. And we have done this for several years now, where we've brought in county commissioners, mayors, people involved with government that want to learn how water works. And we've had great response from Fort Collins and Loveland and Greeley. So the Water Center, that's part of the reason the Water Center is here, is to get out that information.
I think so. Just to push back, I think like some people maybe who live here would say, you know, we need to be this sort of sprawl that's taking place in some of these neighborhoods. Like, we need to be mandating some of these changes and not just expect that people are going to change their landscaping just because they feel like it. Do those sorts of programs work? And like, do those sort of mandatory, you know, this is how development has to take place, do those actually work?
I think, yeah, you can set up an ethos in which case, in which pretty much everybody will buy in to the idea that you've got to be a steward, if you like, of key resources. I think in the West, I mean, I'm an outsider, I should be careful, but I think in the West there is still a view of some people coming west that this is the wide open spaces, this is the place where you can do what you want to do. You're less fettered by the state or anybody telling you what to do. And there is a movement, I know, towards a different kind of idea of the West. Of a West where, yes, there are great natural resources, there are wonderful places to go, the vistas are great, the forests are great, the rivers are great, and so on, but that this needs tending, that this needs stewardship. So it's not the kind of wide empty space that you can kind of pillage. It's a place that you have to respect and have stewardship over, and that is coming. I mean, you know, I recognize that every time I come to the US, more and more people out in the West are talking in that kind of language. But I guess it's work in progress. But as both the other two have said, it's an educational process and it needs constant work. Mm-hmm. But I believe it can be done.
Another question that just came in from Facebook, Aaron asks, it's interesting about more efficient irrigation. I heard a presentation from Ducks Unlimited. They discovered that when farmers went from flood irrigation to more efficient sprinklers, that wetlands for wildfire and birds dried up. How do you balance out these various concerns and address the unintended consequences?
Well, you could certainly go for it's crazy that in arid parts of the world, including the American West, people will still irrigate their crops by flooding their fields. Much of that water just gets evaporated, especially as temperatures are rising, and it's lost to the river basin. Somebody maybe downstream or downwind will receive that moisture, but it's lost to the system locally. Sprinklers are better. Though even sprinkler irrigation loses a lot to evaporation if it's done during the day. Drip irrigation is even better. You just have little pipes, plastic or metal pipes, delivering water more or less drop by drop to the roots of the crops. And if you do that, you can reduce the amount of water that you need to irrigate by 40, 50, 60, or 70%. There's a downside that some of the water that you were losing before goes underground and you can pump it up again. And if it doesn't get underground, you can't pump it up again. So it can get complicated, but essentially drip irrigation will reduce the evaporation rates by a staggering amount. The trick then is to make sure that you then save that water and use it for other purposes rather than just irrigating twice as many crops. If you do that, the farmer may get a bit richer, but the river will see no benefit. But yeah, around the world, about 70% of the water that we take from nature is used for agricultural irrigation. And in arid areas, the figure can get to 90% or more. We can reduce that very, very substantially. You can halve it probably and still get the same crops. If you start changing the crops that you grow less thirsty crops, remove the cotton and put in something else, remove the sugar or the rice or whatever people are growing, and grow crops that require less water, you can do better again. The problem is because we've seen water as an unlimited resource, we haven't previously been making those kind of decisions. They're collective decisions. They're decisions that can't always be made by an individual farmer. There need to be financial and regulatory incentives. But it can be done. It can be done.
I would just add briefly to that. This is one of those irrigation efficiency, at least in the Colorado River Basin, is one of those issues where you open one box and there's like another box and then another box, and you can like very easily start falling down inside of it. There's places in the basin where high intensity agriculture takes place. You look at places like the Imperial Valley in California, down in kind of the Yuma, Arizona area, where the farmers there argue that flood irrigation is really the only way to keep doing agriculture there, because the soils end up being so salty that they flood their fields to push the salt out of the soil so that you can actually grow crops in it. So I think sometimes people have this fantasy of, oh, we can just make all irrigation efficient across the entire basin and it's all going to kind of look the same, which just doesn't really play out on the ground like that. Like every solution is going to have to be tailored to a particular area in order to make it successful.
Yeah, you're right, but the salt only got into the water, or in many places only got into the soil because of the irrigation. So more efficient irrigation would reduce the amount of salt that got into the soil, and therefore you need less water to flush it out again. So don't go too far with that argument. I take the point.
I said it was the farmers saying and not me.
Yeah, I'm sure you're right.
On the Colorado River, we have salinity issues, and it's not so much because they're flooding their fields, it's just the geologic structure that we have that contributes to that. So it's an issue that we have been dealing with the 7 states in the United States for quite a while, and with a very successful program.
And it's important to dispel one myth here, which is that water doesn't act like gasoline, which is to say you often get more than one crack at using it. You know, in gasoline, you get one crack, you better be as efficient as you can, otherwise it's waste heat. In the case of water that's not actually turned into water vapor, that is to say, what we engineers call consumed, actually gets returned to some kind of water body. So a flood irrigation field, there's a lot of water that runs off either on the surface or under the ground, and that actually gets reused. And there have been cases, Luke, as you point out, where if you do efficiency to extreme measures, you actually can increase the amount of water that's consumed, and that's the ultimate gain here. So as I loved how you put that, Luke, open one box and another one appears. It's a really tricky situation in lots of places in the basin.
But Brad, if you're talking in an environment in which evaporation rates are increasing because of higher temperatures, I think you're going to push the system more towards one in which the water that's, yes, you're losing more water from the system every time you irrigate a field because more water is evaporating from the field, the same as it is from forest land. So what you say is of course quite true, and the devil often is in local detail, and you cannot have a one-size-fits-all policy for these things. There will be circumstances in which you're right, but we really have to look at that evaporation issue.
No, I completely agree, and this gets at hot drought and everything I've said before, but I really want to make the distinction here between consumptive and non-consumptive use. And much of what you use in your house is non-consumptive. You make that water dirty, and then it runs off the sewage treatment plant and gets rejuvenated in some way. The water that you use outside your house and your landscaping is in fact consumed and removed from the hydrologic cycle for this moment. We'll return later, but it's gone now. So it's really important to understand those two differences because this is a can of worms.
Thank you for the question, Aaron. That was great.
I think we have time for one more quick question. And Peggy asks, do you foresee climate migration being an active part of our Western future out of cities like Las Vegas, Phoenix, and Albuquerque, as well as agricultural shifts?
You know, I'll jump on that. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, Phoenix just set a record for 110-degree days. You know, I'm not living in Phoenix, I'll tell you that. It's possible that Denver gets like Albuquerque, actually, as this warming continues, and people might want to leave Denver, but that's a long, long ways away. I do think we need to think about this. I will tell you, a few years ago, I was in Idaho, and they'd had something like 60 smoky days in a row, and I thought, oh man, we're lucky to live in Colorado. We don't get those kind of fires. Well, this year, all of a sudden, air quality here is a real issue, right? And, you know, I mean, if I had to live through 60 days of crummy air quality, I might think about living somewhere else myself because it's miserable. I mean, you can do very little. So climate migration is going to be a real thing. It will affect real estate. Climate will affect real estate prices. And it is something we need to think about. I think Colorado maybe is a destination just because it's cooler and higher. These fires add an element of uncertainty to that, but we're probably going to get to live with that.
So do you think people are going to head back to the Rust Belt soon?
Great Lakes.
It's certainly possible. My co-author moved to Michigan recently, and he's very happy there.
Well, I guess in the last few minutes, one question that I was thinking of as reading through some of Fred's writing was energy consumption labels. Any thoughts on that, on products, and just bringing an awareness of the amount of water usage to create?
Yeah, people are talking, you know, we've had your carbon footprint or your energy footprint of products, and, you know, labeling is beginning to include all these things. I think there's a strong case for having a water footprint label on, especially thirsty products. Rice, maybe your cotton t-shirt, how much water did it take to grow that? A lot of foodstuffs take an awful lot of water, especially if they come from irrigation. It would be quite interesting to see if consumer behavior changed if there was a little label there saying how much water was used in the production of this product.
Well, we are headed towards the end of wrapping up this session. I would like to thank all the authors, all the attendees, Luke for helping moderate the panel and the great questions that we have. If you'd like to purchase Fred's book, When the Rivers Run Dry, just go to oldfirehousebooks.com/bookfest2020. If you forget, you could even Google that and they'll find it. And book plates available from select authors. Please indicate in the comment section if you order, if you'd like a signed copy. Finally, please go to focobookfest.org and fill out our survey. We rely on your input in planning future book festivals. So again, thank you for this great presentation. A lot of good questions and lots of great topics that make everyone want to research more and learn more and see how we can all together address these problems in the future and with our actions today. So again, thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.